what I'm going to cover is starting with a little bit of background on data, then aiming to introduce a bit of a concept on what you can use to define what we're actually talking about when we mean big data, looking at the emerging ecosystem, and you can probably guess what's hiding behind some of those topic lines, a blended future. I'll preempt that bit. It's not going to be one or the other. It's not going to be about one technology pushing out another, but we're certainly seeing massive shifts, and in fact, Peter alluded to some of those very powerfully in his presentation. And of course, we will take a look at opportunities and challenges. So this is a research view, and this is very much the view that is aiming to look at the broader picture, but bearing in mind, of course, when I show the research data, of which you have the first lot appearing here, it's also a self-selected audience. It is the reg reader. So this is not aiming to be indicative of what's going on in the wide world. Now, I'm quite surprised. Maybe it's because I'm between you and lunch and you're focusing on your rumbling stomachs. At this point, I probably expected somebody to throw a missile of some description because of that division between structured and unstructured data we've used in the context of our survey. Because, of course, there is no such thing as a really clean division between the two. In fact, the purists would probably tell you there is no such thing as unstructured data. All data has structure in some form or other. But for the purposes of this research and for the purposes of the context of the big data topic, it does make sense at least to try and come up with a dividing line. And that dividing line is very much between the data that is structured in the sense of you've put it into a relational database management system or something that you've already got that has a very defined structure, very defined access mechanisms, processing mechanisms, etc. The unstructured bucket actually contains a whole spectrum of potential structures which range from very structured, such as log files. That is totally structured. You know exactly what kind of data items to expect and the format in which to expect them. There's just one hell of a lot of them, and we'll come back to that. Then you've got sort of curious beasts in between, and let me use Twitter as an example. Twitter actually has one hell of a lot of structure because it has a limit, total of 160 minus a few for the control characters, so that is very much structure. It has very defined conventions. It uses symbols that mean something, just like in a markup language. But beyond that, all bets are off. You could have anything contained within those characters. And then, of course, you have completely different data types, such as blogs, pictures, videos, and all the rest of it. So that's what we're putting for the purposes of the big data topic into that unstructured category, but bearing in mind that it's actually a very loose term containing all kinds of structure. What we're seeing overall here, and that's what the chart really shows you, and that is data is growing, hence that topic line, data, data everywhere. Some people call it data deluge because it really is growing a lot. But what is important to note, a lot of people talk about the data explosion in social media, etc., etc., etc. But look at the numbers in that top chart. There is as much growth, albeit in slightly different percentages, in what you might regard as the existing corporate system, what we've already got. That is continuing to grow as well. And when we asked our reg readers what's behind that data growth, I'm sure you can probably recite the mantra just as well as I can. And we probably, out of the 122 readers who responded to the survey, we probably had 100 different types of data items that are causing growth. Some driven externally by regulation and compliance, some driven just by the fact that more data is available through logs, through machine-to-machine communication, instrumentation. We heard from Genevieve earlier on just about all that data that's coming from everywhere. But then there are also some comments about badly designed software. People not following rules, not ever throwing anything away. Who's ever managed to keep just one version of a document, an Excel spreadsheet or a PowerPoint file? Yeah, all those things have a habit of multiplying, a bit like when you're the rabbits that we heard about earlier on when you're not looking. But then look at companies where each data file is 500 megabytes large to start with. Engineering firms, architecture firms, they're in that bracket. So all forms of data are growing, regardless of where you're coming from. Some of that data is well-structured, but in huge files. Some of it is badly structured in huge files. Some is well-structured, but there's just masses and masses of it, as already alluded to. And then, of course, there are other business drivers as well, such as expansion and growth. Some companies are forced to expand because of the current business situation. And yes, there are some that are growing, and it's causing them problems. It may sound counterintuitive in the current environment of gloom and doom, which is why I thought I'd just throw a little bit of good news in here as well. So data is growing, but where is it actually sitting? You can tell from this that obviously there is a lot in existing formats, and so it's not a surprise when we see from the research, and by the way, this is not going to be a presentation just about the data. We will come on to other stuff, but it's important to see some of that background when we look at over 50% of the respondents hold their most valuable data, the critical data, what we call the crown jewels in their corporate data in terms of information, what's it worth to the company. Most of that is either held exclusively or mostly in structured format as defined in relational databases, etc. today. And yet, what we're also hearing is that all of that mass of unstructured data is also becoming increasingly important. But what about the capability of exploiting that unstructured bucket? No surprises here. When we look at how companies today are exploring their information assets, then that is mostly the capabilities are in the structured data arena. And mostly that will be, of course, in existing business intelligence systems, data warehousing systems, etc., closely related to the relational databases we already mentioned. Interestingly, that there is quite a proportion of companies that feel they're not even able to make proper use of what they've got in structured form. And that, of course, is another discussion which I'll try not to get into too much today because we just don't have the time. But it really can't be underestimated, the difficulty caused just by, first of all, trying to understand what the data is actually that's available and then what to do with it. But when we look at the unstructured side, and in case you think there's nothing, there is actually a tiny sliver of respondents that say, well, respondents, 0.8% that say, yeah, we are actually quite good at exploring unstructured data. That may well be one of those companies that is among the pioneers in the big data arena, as it's so nicely labeled. But the fact remains that historically, it's been very, very hard to deal with the unstructured data for two reasons, and of course, they are related. Number one is to identify what to pull out of that mass, or not to say morass of data, and then how to decide what it's worth. You know, when you look at what's happening up here, all that is undoubtedly massive investment. Those systems do not come cheap. So when you're looking at areas where you don't even know what it is that's going to be of value and how best to extract it, in particular in the current economic environment, you're going to have some difficulty saying, well, I need lots of money, but I don't actually know what I'm going to get out of it. And as we've already heard from Peter as well, you're looking at a different raft of technologies. It tends to be technologies that people aren't quite so well versed in today, and yet we hope, but there is certainly a lot of work to be done, and I'll come on to some of what is being done in a moment. But just to stay with data for one more slide here, the other aspect that needs to be taken into account today from an enterprise computing perspective is that it's not just the internal data, but there are also data streams from outside. And to that end, we asked our respondents to what extent they were actually making use of or getting high-volume streams or feeds of data from outside their company. When we look at the ones that say extensively, that's probably a lot among the existing suspects, for example, financial services and the capital markets firms with their market data. Then you have anything that takes in seismic data, geological data, weather data, genetic data. So there are a lot of established data streams, but there are also a lot of new data streams. So we're ranging from the extensively to what's going on to a not insignificant 20% here that say, well, we are actually expecting external data feeds to become of importance. And the reason for that is manifold. And of course, it's very, very specific, not just to the industry, but also to the company. And as a little sidetrack here, as analysts, we often get asked which industry is ahead of other industries when it comes to adopting some of the new technologies. But it tends not to work like that. It tends to be much more individual companies that pick things up once you get out of the experimental phase, which tends, for not surprising reasons, to be concentrated in the high-tech sector, sometimes defense, depending, again, on the area of development. But what we're finding is when it comes to the early adopters, it really could be any industry. And that's why also those external data feeds, they can be different between companies. For some, it's mainly around advertising and campaign data that's coming in real time from partners. For others, it's location data. For yet others, it's about Google Analytics, or it's about satellite data, or it's about tracking data. And tracking can mean a variety of things. It can mean tracking a fleet of vehicles, or it can mean tracking your competitors to see what they're up to in order to take more real-time business decisions. So that's the data side. Let's look at the big data side now. And again, I'm fully expecting to be shot down in flames on some of this. But of course, as analysts, we have to have a 2x2. You know, you can't do without one. And here is an attempt at putting big data in context, because if we just say big data, you know, it doesn't really mean anything, because a lot of data is big in that sense. But if we have either big data in capital letters or inverted commas, what we're looking at is an environment where what's defining today's big data is a low value density. And you say, what on earth does she mean by that? Or what on earth did Dale mean by that when he first came up with it? Well, I've already alluded to the fact that a lot of those semi-structured or quite well-structured streams, but currently not in existing systems, they tend to be huge data streams, which undoubtedly have some value in them, but as I've mentioned already, you may not know where that value lies. So when you talk to people about big data, phrases that you often hear are panning for gold, trying to find the needle in the haystack, or signal-to-noise ratio. And that's really what it's all about. You've got a lot of noise with a very weak signal, and that's what makes big data fall into that left-hand side of a low-value density. That doesn't mean there's not anything of value in there. You just don't know where it is. Hence those phrases, panning for gold, needle in the haystack. Structured, as I've already mentioned, that's where you've got your log files and anything that has a more easily identifiable structure. Unstructured, that's where a lot of the social media data types, a lot of the multimedia data types fall into. High value density is your existing systems, your business intelligence and data warehousing, your traditional existing search and document management systems. It's sad if those were not to have a high value density, because that would suggest that what you've put in them is either the wrong thing or you don't know how to analyze it. But leaving that to one side now, from a conceptual perspective, this is where your high value density lies. In the big data, you've got low value density, and what you're looking at very much is technologies that provide a price-performance level that allows you to find that needle in the haystack. And it may well be, and this is where, if I could do this interactively, I would start stretching that big data star down here and up there, because it may well be that once you have found what's of value, if you're able to identify a pattern behind what's of value, if you're able to identify a more structured and defined way of getting it out of that big haystack, then you may well find that it migrates into your existing high-value density systems. So it's about finding patterns, it's about finding correlations, it's about finding trends. And that is, of course, why you have particular technologies coming to the fore here, because they enable you to do that. And I'll come on to a little bit in a moment of that. But one thing that is also very, very important to note, well, two things really. Number one, you don't have to have a big company to be a big company to have a big data problem. You can be a tiny little company with a huge big data problem if you're being overwhelmed by all kinds of data streams, possibly from your own systems, possibly from external systems. The sort of thing that Genevieve was alluding to earlier this morning, you can be a tiny little company and have those issues. And the other point is, it's not the hype, and my subtitle, What's Hot and What's Hype. The hype is around very much the social data. When you look at IT departments, when they first cut their teeth on applying some of those new big data technologies, where do they start? Right up there with systems log files. Because they understand them, they're familiar with them, and in fact, that's one of the areas where there is already quite a bit of development, and that's IT people saying, we can improve the way in which we're running our data centers through applying some of these big data technologies to our log files. Because when you look at it, it's not about absolute uptime, it's about what gets delivered to the business. And if you can identify the patterns of what may be causing a bottleneck further down the line, for instance, then you're able to provide much better systems management capabilities than you can when you get the error message or you get the irate phone call from somebody saying, why is whatever down, why can't I get at my reporting? One of the challenges that comes out of it, and I've already mentioned, governance is a big issue, but just as a preemptive comment here, one of the big challenges when you're trying to get value out of that low value density, if you found something, you've got a new set of data. What do you do with it? Who owns it? Who's allowed to do what with it? Back to governance again. But without going down that road too much, I'll just give you one example at this point from a company that has already started that journey between the high and low value density, and also showing that you can go completely the other way. And that is JP Morgan Chase. Has anybody followed what they're doing with in the big data arena. Quite an interesting case, because they've actually been working with a particular technology, which I'll come on to in a moment, for about 3 years now. But they are taking data out of half a dozen different OLAP systems and are pushing it into their big data shared processing center in order to see what else they can find. And recently, with all the turmoil going on in the markets, one of the areas in which they were doing that was to try and figure out exactly what their client's exposure was to Greece. And they found that that's when they were taking it out of, they had all the reporting data, it's sitting very much here, but they were resorting to technologies here in order to find extra bits, as it were, technical term. Finally, before we come onto some of the technologies a little bit, just to provide context as well, there is a language emerging around big data as well. Aside from the definitional 2x2 that I just showed, there is also the language around the 3 V's: volume, variety, and velocity. And you can read for yourself. I hope that everybody can read for themselves how those are defined. And as a rule of thumb, when I say we say, I mean that in the widest sense. The vendor community, the analyst community, the research community. As a rule of thumb, it's around big data is when 2 of these 3 apply. Because just large volumes does not big data make. Now, so far, I have successfully avoided mentioning one term, and I will resist the most dreadful pun of the morning, because you will know what it is when you see that slide. And that is, yes, it is now the elephant in the room, I suppose, and that's Hadoop. Hadoop, who's familiar with Hadoop in the sense that you've heard of it? Yeah, quite a few. Who's actually working with Hadoop? Wow. That's actually quite a high proportion, and you can then tell me what I've got wrong or where my misconceptions are on Hadoop, because I've only looked at Hadoop purely from a research perspective, including not just the theory, but also in practice, what are people actually doing with it. The reason that I'm putting Hadoop up here and not anything else in the big data arena is that it's not just, and when I say a technology, that's wrong, of course. It's a set of technologies. It's an entire ecosystem. But if we just use it in the loosest possible way now, there is enough noise around it, which, you know, why noise? But also some very, very real life stuff behind that in terms of deployments and also deployments, trials, whichever way you want to call it. And there is a lot of investment going into it. Recently, Hadoop World took place in New York, and it's fair to say that, I mean, it's always difficult because announcements are kept, obviously, for big events like that. But of the $100 million of investment that went into Hadoop-related firms this year, about 90 million was announced in around and before Hadoop World. So that's not insignificant investment going into Hadoop today. And of course, it's a bit of both. You know, why is the investment being made? If people just shout it's a great technology, it doesn't usually happen. It's because there really is a genuine pull from firms that are using Hadoop seriously. And as part of that pull, we're also seeing just about every established player I can think of in some way or other is making investments in Hadoop or related technologies. And to mention just a few, IBM with its big insights, they've got Hadoop in there. Informatica is the first firm in the business intelligence arena that I came across that's developed native extensions for Hadoop. And I'll mention in a moment why that's so relevant. And then for those of you that are watching this closely, a significant development just a couple of weeks ago, Microsoft. For those of you that work in high-performance computing, you may have heard of the Dryad project, which was intended to bring high-performance computing to Microsoft, to Windows. Microsoft's given up on that. Microsoft has now asked Hortonworks to do Hadoop for Windows, to extend Hadoop to both Windows Server and Azure. Quite how they're going to do that with big data, I don't know, given the data limit on Azure today, but that's another discussion which is to be had separately. So that is what's happening on the vendor side, and those investments wouldn't be going on if it weren't for what companies are already doing with it. So if I can just mention a couple of projects which you may find interesting, or not, as the case may be, because you say, yeah, that's not relevant to us. Some of the projects are going on in companies where you say, yeah, but they're pushing the envelope, or they have more of a requirement for that type of technology. For example, Facebook. They are doing a lot with HBase, but what makes Facebook's initiative significant there, they're apparently using it in real time. For those technologies to be started to be used in real time, that requires some serious investment, and some people might say it also requires some serious desperation, either because the existing technologies can't do what they want it to do, or because the price points are no longer right. And that's in fact something that I'm hearing a lot where companies say, yeah, my existing providers, and the guilty shall remain nameless now, could do what we wanted to do, but what they want is just ridiculous. I'm not paying that. So there is a lot of drive that is actually around cost. People looking at, because of course Hadoop itself is open source, and most of the ecosystem at this point is all open source. So you're looking at potentially cheaper ways, and not just with the software, but also typically what you have is obviously commodity hardware being used there. Then you've got eBay. eBay said some time ago that there was no search engine that could do what eBay needs it to do. And if anybody's interested in the statistics, I've got them with me here, because obviously eBay has quite some search throughput. They are replacing their existing search engine on eBay with something called Cassini. So if you want to find out more about the project, eBay Cassini is your Google term. Again, it's Hadoop and HBase. And it is eBay's biggest engineering project, and it's due to go live next year. And the final project I'll just mention here is JP Chase. As I've already mentioned, they've been doing it for 3 years. 5 out of the 7 Chase business units are using Hadoop today. And what makes it interesting, and therein also lies an IT management and governance lesson again, it's a shared resource. It is not individual business units doing Hadoop. It is a corporate project. It is all shared. And it is used for a wide variety of things. Some of it is around Basel III. Some of it is about fraud investigation. And I stress, it's fraud investigation. It's not the fraud detection that goes on using existing high-performance technologies to try and, catch a fraudulent credit card transaction on the fly, which you then discover when your card's been declined. This is about more complex cases where you are back to the proverbial trying to find the needle in the haystack. They're also using it for ETL in business intelligence, the extract, transform, and load. So again, you see that there is no clear cut between the two worlds. And last but by no means least, they've almost by accident found that Hadoop and associated technologies lends itself quite well to low-cost storage. Stuff that you don't know when you want, what you want, and you just want to keep it there. So those are some of the things that are going on. Let's try and work the button. This is what it looks like, simplified version. For those of you that are Register readers, you recognize this. Yes, this is from a recent Register article. The picture was taken at the recent conference in New York that I already mentioned, Hadoop World. And it is a simplified version of the stack. and a simplified version of the Hadoop ecosystem, where you see all these names here, Apache Zookeeper, Flume, HBase, et cetera, that really is just a small selection of technologies and developments and projects that are going on there. Had I known before Sunday night I was presenting today, I would have constructed my own version of this and made it suitably complicated, but this is probably enough. The serious point behind all this is, and obviously everybody is aware that this technology is still quite immature. It's not enterprise ready from the point of view of the skills required, the level of stability, the bugs that are still in there. Mind you, you can have those in so-called release software as well. It's not an enterprise play yet, even though some enterprises, those with the skills, are using it for serious today. But what we are seeing, and that's what I'm using this picture as representative of, what we are seeing is the risk of a repeat of what happened with early Java and what's happened with other projects as well. And that is the risk of bifurcation, of overlap, of things going all over the place. What really is the core of Hadoop? Where can vendors build extensions to it? Who will win out in this? If I'm trying to take a decision, what should I actually go with? Which vendor, which product? A colleague, or I should say former colleague of mine, described it wonderfully when he said the existing Hadoop ecosystem is like a brick wall that they're rebuilding every day. You're never quite sure which bricks are going to be used and whether all the bricks are in the pile yet to be used. So there needs to be, a lot of work needs to be done there to make that more enterprise friendly, but in particular as well when it comes to integration with existing systems. One of the corporate speakers at Hadoop World made a very, very strong plea to the entrepreneurs and players in the Hadoop ecosystem and said, please, please don't invent new standards. Work with existing ones. Enable us to move between the two worlds, because there is no way that companies are going to throw away their existing systems. Equally, it's clear that we are moving into that new world. So let's just zoom out from the Hadoop ecosystem for something that's a bit easier on the eye, even though it contains a lot of text. We've called this zooming out because this really isn't just about Hadoop. This is about, if we're looking at it in a sort of stack view from the bottom up, you have a bunch of technologies here, a bunch of common categories, where you have traditional existing technologies and new technologies, not only coming together and overlapping. So if you look at scale-out storage, yeah, Hadoop, but lots of existing data warehouse technologies use scale-out technologies today. Same thing with indexing and analytics. You can do that with so-called big data technologies. You can Hadoop, or you can use a proprietary grid. So all through there runs a bit of everything, and we are seeing the blending. Just to give you a tiny little eBay data point here, eBay's got 9 petabytes of storage, and they've got that on a mixed Hadoop and Teradata cluster. And there is no reason to believe that they won't in some way or other keep that mix. In the same way as JP Morgan Chase is moving between OLAP systems and their Hadoop system and all the way back again. And in fact, some of the discussions that are already going on, and I was reminded of those by Peter's comment about, you know, some things are moving down the stack and things just work together differently, is that the debate is how much of existing, even transactional technology will move into Hadoop, and how much of Hadoop will move out into other technologies. And this is where we really come to one of the most frustrating points when we talk about these big data technologies. Again, using Hadoop as the example, you can almost do anything you want with Hadoop. It's just a case of, does it make sense to do it? Hadoop clearly doesn't lend itself very well to low latency. It's not suitable for transactional today. It's not suitable for anything that has high complexity, because if you think about the way it works, you know, farming things out to be processed independently and putting them back together at the end, if you have high complexity, that probably would fry your brain trying to put that into a MapReduce environment. And then, of course, there is the whole point around what do I actually need from the system? Where are my trade-offs on price, on performance, on security? I didn't mention security, but for a very good reason. Hadoop has none today. The companies that are using Hadoop are deploying all kinds of mechanisms to keeping it secure. For instance, one of them will literally only allow people to work in the room where the Hadoop stuff is and access to anything to do with the Hadoop-based data that have had special security clearance because of the difficulties in making it secure, internal firewalls, segregated systems, et cetera, et cetera. So there are huge issues to be overcome yet. But what it's all about is deciding which is best, and it's about supplementing, extending, and integrating. And just to keep with the point about going forward, we will be in a world of both. This was the question back to our reg data. We asked companies, how much will you use any of these? And in case you are interested in the data, I understand from the little leaflet that these presentations will be available for download, so you can always look at the detail later. If you have any questions, my contact details will be in there as well. We're happy to answer them. The point here is, when it comes to current level of use on the left-hand side, and change in the next 3 years, the biggest change is actually in high-performance relational database management systems. So we are told, bearing in mind this is a small self-selected sample. But equally importantly, where the growth areas are, that could be in existing technologies, it could be in new data technologies. It is all about the blend, which is also why it's not a surprise when we ask people about, and these statements are kind of complex and lengthy to read, but we were asking people about these new developments in advanced storage, access, and analytics, whether these would allow companies to tackle problems that were previously too hard. A pretty overwhelming yes to varying degrees. And similarly, that these new developments would allow key business requirements to be tackled. Put differently, allowing companies to run their business better through better availability of better data, availability of better analytics. So it is about, to use a somewhat grand phrase, a new world dawning, but it's not about replacement. And to quote, I think it's the guy from eBay who said, HBase is not a replacement for us. It's a new tool in the tool belt, and it's a valuable one, but we're not throwing anything else out. Supplement, extend, integrate. Along with that, goes without saying, a less prescriptive approach to analytics, going from the prescriptive, this is what I'm looking for, to the, what can I find? And that's where all those big data technologies come in, where the low density comes in that I talked about. But very, very importantly in this new world, skills. Peter really highlighted skills. I'll highlight skills some more, other than the fact that people in New York on the stage said, because apparently every speaker said, I've got vacancies for people with Hadoop expertise. The demand is running way ahead of supply, just like happened with Java. Demand is way ahead of supply, to the extent that speakers got up saying, I'm offering 10% more than the previous speaker. But who are the people with the right skills is number one, because you are looking at a much, and when I say lower level of skills requirement, what I actually mean by that, deeper down in the stack. And that's also why, for example, SQL experts are finding it incredibly difficult to work with Hadoop and HBase. Not only because it's a different paradigm, but because they're not used to being quite that far down in the weeds. So that is certainly worth bearing in mind. The other point worth bearing in mind is all about that another new term that keeps being floated around, and that is data scientist. And there is a conscious attempt being made to say, this is different from your existing expert because you do need a new blend of skills. And to some extent, it's a blend of skills that you might say is difficult to find. Peter said it as well, and he said, well, you're either one or the other, and then you need to combine both. Well, you need people that understand data sources, that understand the statistics, that can come to terms with the concepts of relevance, that understand business intelligence. You can find that in developers, you may find it in database architects, you may find it in different places. But the one aspect that's probably common to all of them is maths. And that's probably what puts the heebie-jeebies in quite a few people when you look at the math skills that are out there. I don't think we need to say much more about that because I've spoken at length about blending approaches where you go from the exploratory into the traditional environment. But as I mentioned with my previous JP Morgan Chase example, you can go the other way as well. And that is increasingly how it's going to work out. Now, in beginning to wrap up here, we cannot have a presentation without cloud, I'm sorry. Cloud has to come into it whether we like it or not. And no, we haven't even bothered to define it in this context because it is all-encompassing. It could be private, it could be hybrid, it could be third-party hosted. I would not say public because that's probably not realistic with the types of data you're looking at. But from what our respondents are telling us, cloud has a role to play in all of those areas because it allows you to scale up, to scale down, to experiment with different environments, but of course bearing in mind that if Hadoop's involved, exercise great care. Now in closing, starting at the bottom here, this is the real no-brainer. No, of course, this new stuff does not mean the end of traditional systems, as if we needed to have it proven. But also, and this is the top result here, the top graph, or top bar, the term big data is being overhyped. So anybody in the room from a vendor, beware of the hype, not only because IT professionals out there are regarding it as hype, but also because those self-same IT professionals don't actually feel, that's what the top bar shows us here, they don't actually feel that vendors are that well placed today at helping enterprises with coming to terms with this new world. And a last point, which again, if you're in the business here, you don't need to be told this, that the whole licensing mechanisms and commercial arrangements are just not in place. And if we look at what's going on with cloud, there really is a lot to be done still. Not everybody is equally bad, but some of the things that we hear about licensing and cloud, and by extension, licensing some of those data-related developments, some of those comments I could not repeat here. It would probably be caught in an obscenity filter. And in conclusion, no surprises, data volumes will continue to increase. New architectures and technologies have an important role. I hope I was able to bring that out. But I would also like to bring in a quote here from one of our respondents in relation to those new architectures and technologies. Cheaper and faster ways of doing dumb things will continue producing dumb things. In particular, when looking at the key challenges, the lack of skills I have mentioned, that certainly has a role to play. Security issues need to be addressed very, very urgently. And there is indeed a risk of so-called standards proliferation. And of course, the moment you've got more than one standard for the same thing, you have a difficulty as well. But overall, and that is the comment I'd like to leave you with, apart from saying data governance once again, this is not about or, it's about and. And with that, I thank you for your attention.